Good soldiers were those that were able to kill, however uncouth they were. We made them like this. Good sons, good daddies, good elder brothers at home were brought to the front to kill each other. Human beings turned into murdering demons. Everyone became a demon within 3 months. Men were able to fight courageously, only when their human characteristics were suppressed. It was a natural extension of our training back in Japan. This was the Emperor's army. That is from the account of Tominaga Shozo, a Japanese officer stationed in China during the Second World War. His account is brutally honest, and he doesn't shy away from discussing the terrible things he did or made others do in China. Not only does it show the brutality of the Japanese Empire under the grip of fascist rule, but it gives us an insight into how normal people can be driven to do terrible things. He talks about turning people into murderers by making soldiers kill prisoners as a baptism of blood, as he calls it. It made soldiers more willing to kill in the future, because they'd already taken that first terrible step. The Japanese military had to turn normal people into the killers that their leaders wanted, willing to dish out but also accept death at a moment's notice in order to advance the war. This is one of the most important lessons I think we can learn from the history of World War II. And while people often ask why German society can be radicalized in such a way, and how normal people can be driven to do such terrible things, how many times have you seen someone ask that question about Japan? And why do we never seem to ask that question? I don't think the average American thinks American World War II propaganda about Japan is accurate. But honestly, I don't think they think that much about it at all. But that doesn't mean that some of its core ideas don't persist in our popular understanding. Most people, when asked, would probably tell you that the fanaticism of World War II Japan had something to do with honor, or Bushido, or emperor worship, or whatever. They may not be as explicit as American World War II propaganda, but this still chalks up Japanese fascism to Japanese culture, something which I think takes away from the lessons that this history can teach us. So today, let's hear what Japanese soldiers actually believed and how they felt about their experiences during the war and juxtapose it to some American World War II propaganda. I'm not going to try to debunk American World War II propaganda. I don't really think that needs to be done. I just want to use the actual words and experiences of Japanese soldiers to get y'all to think a little bit. Understand the war from the Japanese perspective, not to justify anything Japan did, but if anything, show the true cruelty of the Japanese Empire and how it twisted normal people into weapons for its own evil purposes. The most famous American propaganda film about Japan during World War II is Know Your Enemy Japan. In fact, I'd say a few of you watching this have probably heard of it. The reason it's so famous, even though it was released and quickly retracted at the war's end, is because of how well it boils down the American perspective in its hour runtime.
We shall never completely understand the Japanese mind, but then they don't understand ours either. First, let's examine a typical Japanese soldier. His average height is 5 feet 3 inches. His average weight 117 pounds. He and his brother soldiers are as much alike as photographic prints off the same negative.
The film makes it clear that the American government viewed Japan as a kind of inhuman enemy, more of a force of mindless robots or monsters rather than actual people. This view is, of course, racist and incorrect, and it wasn't just repeated in Know Your Enemy Japan, but other propaganda films that are far less famous. A training film for the US Navy, Our Enemy the Japanese, expressed the same view.
And I can testify that they are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet. The real difference is in their minds. You cannot measure Japanese sense of logic by any Western yardstick. Their weapons are modern, their thinking 2,000 years out of date.
So let's dive into the Japanese mind and see what Japanese soldiers really thought and felt about the war. I think you'll find they're anything but prints off the same negative. I'm most interested in dissecting a few individuals, from true believers who stake their lives on Japan's mission of conquest, to the average Joe taken from his village, given a gun, and shipped abroad. I won't be able to tell you what all Japanese soldiers really believed, or even what the average Japanese soldier thought, but the accounts of these few individuals are still very important. I think it can give us an on-the-ground view of history, so we can get as close as we possibly can to seeing what it was like to actually be there. Plus, I always find oral history more impactful. I love the big picture stuff, but I always find it more meaningful when I've read an account of someone who actually experienced it firsthand. I think the most pervasive misconception about Japanese belief during World War II is that all people actually believed that the emperor was a god. Certainly it was part of Japanese propaganda at the time, and to doubt the emperor's authority or importance could have gotten you a visit from the secret police. However, people's actual beliefs are often more challenging to control. Nevertheless, American propaganda films keep harping on the importance of the divine emperor and how all Japanese people supposedly believed it.
To the 70 million people of Japan, Hirohito, their emperor, is a god, through direct descent from the great sun goddess Amaterasu. They believe that he personally owns Japan, its land, its resources, and even themselves. And they believe that it is the right and destiny of Japan's emperors to rule the whole world. to bring about the fulfillment of this destiny and to destroy all nations and peoples which stand in the way of its fulfillment is the sacred duty of Japan's Army and Navy.
For his flag not only represents his country, it is also the image of his god of gods. His flag is the rising sun, and the rising sun is a symbol of the emperor. To the Japanese, their emperor is the most holy of holies, their visible god.
And since from the beginning the emperor gods have mingled their flesh with mortal flesh, it follows that all Japanese are cousins in divinity. All are members of one family, whose blood is superior to the blood of any other race on earth, because it is mixed with the liquid sunshine of the gods. And what's more, they believe it.
It is true that the imperial cult was central to Japanese ultranationalist ideology and propaganda, but these films make it seem like it was some universal, unshaking piece of Japanese culture. However, in all the accounts I read, it seems harder to find someone who actually believed the emperor was a god than it is to find someone who held private doubts or just straight up never believed. After all, the divinity of the emperor was used as rhetoric and state ritual during the creation of a modern, uniquely Japanese nation-state. It was not initially part of personal religious practice or belief for most Japanese people. In historian Jason Josephson's book, The Invention of Religion in Japan, he claims, Japanese uniqueness was asserted by claiming to be the only country with an unbroken imperial line. What is more, Japanese elites did not actually need to be convinced of the reality of the divine descent of the emperor. All that really mattered was that the Japanese populace needed to act as if the emperor were the heart of the nation to produce social cohesion. The truth or widespread belief in the divinity of the emperor was besides the point. This was the core of Japanese nationalism before the 1930s and 1940s, but as militarists took control, these ideas were reinforced with newfound intensity. The Religious Organizations Law dismantled any remaining shred of religious freedom in 1940, and during the war, public school textbooks promoted the idea of the divine origin of the nation and the descent of the emperor and the people from the Shinto kami. This constituted what scholars have referred to as a kind of secular Shinto or state Shinto. It is not to say that what we call Shintoism, its shrines, festivals, and myths, aren't an important part of Japanese culture. I'm not even saying that the emperor doesn't have a role to play as an important cultural institution. I'm only saying that these things were used to create a nationalist myth, and that the doctrine of the divinity of the emperor has far, far more to do with politics than organically emerging cultural practices and beliefs. But how did Japanese people respond to all this during the war? I want to share a few brief selected portions from a variety of accounts, and then dig into the account of a particular militarist in the Japanese Navy that I think you will all find very interesting. But first, Nohara Teishin, a Japanese soldier who spent years in China, had this to say about the emperor. Nobody fights a war because they like it. Nation's orders, emperor's orders, that's what they say. But what could you do but go? If an order was issued and you didn't go, you were a traitor. There's not one soldier who ever died saying, Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the emperor. I was with hundreds of men when they died. The dead lay with grimaces on their faces. My prime time, my youth, was all spent in the army. I reached the highest enlisted rank, but I always thought it would be better sitting at home here in Toga than being a sergeant major. While Nohara's account reveals that in a soldier's final moments, the emperor was the last thing on their mind, it also shows the effects of nationalism in Japan at the time. Saying that he feels he had to go or would be seen as a traitor, maybe he's just making excuses. But the truth is that support of the military in Japan was quite high in the 1930s and into the 1940s. However, this support did not necessarily extend to the emperor, despite what militarists and Japanese ideologues may have claimed at the time. This contrast is seen in the account of Kumagaya Tokuichi, a factory worker in Japan, who begins his account by talking about his admiration for the Japanese military. You know, the Japanese had a close, warm kind of feeling towards soldiers. Sympathy, you might say. They were sacrificing themselves for the country, and I felt a sense of gratitude for their hard work. People knew that military duty was as hard as a prison sentence. They knew because ordinary people shared the soldiers' hardships. Every autumn, after the harvest, large divisional maneuvers took place in the local rice fields. Soldiers were built in ordinary homes. When I was a boy, all of us in the neighborhood played soldier, using sticks for rifles and swords. Very often, the grown-ups encouraged us to do it. And if you ever saw an actual soldier, you automatically addressed him as Heitai-san, Mr. Soldier. All of us common people really cheered the soldiers during the February 26th incident of 1936. I thought, they've done it. Fantastic. People were looking for a breakthrough because times were hard, and no one thought of war in a realistic way. Even after the rebels backed down, I imagined that a single shot from our army would blow the... Okay, he uses a slur for Chinese people here. I'm just gonna say Chinese people. Okay. I imagined that a single shot from our army would blow the Chinese people away. We went to war with light hearts in 1937 and 1938. The February 26th incident was a failed fascist coup of the Japanese government by a bunch of radical young officers. While Kumagaya starts out talking about the sympathy they had for soldiers, he quickly shows that this also meant political support for the military. by cheering on the coup of February 26th. The story of the coup is interesting and actually shows the factionalism in the Japanese far right at the time, but basically it failed because Emperor Hirohito didn't want to go through with it. You see, Hirohito was a by-the-book kind of fascist who was okay with the government being taken over and with democracy being dismantled, but only if it was done through the proper channels. But this video isn't about that. Kumagaya gives some insight into the support the common people had for militarism in Japan. The Great Depression devastated Japan's economy, especially in rural areas, and economic frustrations led people to look for a radical change. The military seemed like a down-to-earth kind of institution, filled with young men who sacrificed comfort to serve the people. It also, of course, would have been a more approachable institution than the imperial household, which would have intentionally been made so lofty and distant. Kumagaya almost says as much. I started reading Red Flag, the paper of the Communist Party, because of Yoshida, a turner in my factory, who was a year ahead of me in school. I drank cocoa for the first time in my life at his house. He handed over Red Flag with the cocoa. I wasn't particularly interested in ideology, but I was attracted to the Communist Party because I was very poor. And to tell you the truth though, I didn't understand it at all. Down with the Emperor sounded alright to me, because poverty made me distrust authority generally, and I didn't think their rules were doing me any good. I never thought, even as a young boy, that the Emperor was a god. To Kumagaya, the Emperor wasn't divine, but was just some distant authority that wasn't doing anyone any good. I do think it's interesting that this didn't apply to the military for him, which had seemingly successfully made itself seem like a down-to-earth institution, at least to Kumagaya. Of course, this was not true. If anything, the military as an institution cared far, far less for the ordinary Japanese people than the government that young officers had tried to overthrow in 1936. It's a common feature of all far-right movements, I suppose. Make yourself seem anti-establishment or for the common man, when in reality, you support or even bolster hierarchy and authority, while the only radical change you bring is chaos and death. Kumagaya is just one guy, but I think it shows a really interesting example of someone who brought the propaganda in a way that aligned with his personal beliefs. He supported the military, but not the emperor. This can seem strange, and as you will continue to see, support for the emperor was a pillar of Japanese militarism. In fact, the very same coup plotters Kumagaya says he supported supposedly wished to establish equality in Japan by making all Japanese people equal under the absolute rule of the emperor. While Kumagaya's worldview is inconsistent, it's intensely personal and shows what it meant to be an individual in a society that was trying to force everyone into an ideological mold. But he also shows how strong support for the war was at first, before American bombs began to lay waste to Japanese cities, and before food became scarce as it would in later years. To quote from Kumagaya again, "Looking back at the war years, many people claim they supported the war only because they had no other choice. I think that's a lie. Intellectuals, journalists, educated people, all supported the war actively. The only exception were the communists, and they were in prison. Nobody truly thought Japan would lose. It was taken for granted that we'd stop the war at some reasonable point. Shouts of banzai sent off everything from soldiers and military horses to trains and airplanes. We held so many lantern parades to celebrate our victories. Why have we forgotten that in defeat?" People who drink the Kool-Aid, to use the common metaphor, always have their own reasons for doing so, and often decide how much they're going to believe. I'm sure that each one of those intellectuals, journalists, and educated people that Kumagaya mentions all had their own reasons for supporting the war at first. However, when the war went on to destroy Japan, it can be hard for people to accept that they supported the war, which would cause them to lose everything in the end. Kumagaya's honesty is important, and it makes his account stand out in my mind. This doesn't justify supporting militarism, but it shows what that support can look like, and how people use their personal opinions and experiences to inform their support of those who disapprove of individual thought. Let's move on from Kumagaya though. Back to those who actually fought. What drove them to put their lives on the line for Japan? I have found that it is more often a more familiar kind of nationalism. For example, Sakai Saburo, a Zero pilot who volunteered to be a kamikaze in Iwo Jima, said this about why he decided to fly his plane into an American ship. "I called to Muto, a close friend from our China incident days, and asked, 'They say go. What do we do?' 'What do we do, you say? It's decided,' he said. 'We go. We can't live long anyways.' You're right, let's go." I never thought, long live the emperor. To bring the nation to victory was our thought. And what was that nation? The land of my parents, younger brothers, and sister. Can we bear to see our country invaded by outside enemies? That's what was on my mind. He survived only because of luck, and because he couldn't find a target. But here, we see that even among kamikazes, there wasn't necessarily a willingness to die for the emperor that drove people to make those kinds of choices, but a much more familiar desire to defend the nation of one's family. However, I don't really think that justifies anything. Nationalism that leads to this kind of behavior is still bad, but connecting one's family and loved ones to a nation at large is a much more familiar kind of nationalism, especially to Americans. I know saying that is going to make people upset, and the truth is Imperial Japan is much, much worse than the United States, and that's saying something, because we have set the bar kind of high at times. My point is to challenge the notion in American propaganda films that the Japanese
are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet. You cannot measure Japanese sense of logic by any Western yardstick.
I just want to show that the problems of Japan are the problems of modernity, particularly the excess of nationalism as it turns to fascism. But there are, of course, levels to it. Japan is an example of the worst-case scenario, but it's still a scenario that can happen anywhere, in its own unique form. While Japan's leaders may have claimed some crazy shit about how in the heart of every Japanese soldier lives the spirit of the Yamato race, who fights and dies for his divine emperor in service of his holy mission. However, individual soldiers fought for much more familiar things on a personal level. I will continue to sound like a broken record here, but this doesn't justify anything. While Sakai personally was giving his life for his nation as the place where his family lives, he was still doing so in support of an insane racist empire to continue an unjustifiable, and at this point pretty much unwinnable war. It shows that fascists don't really need to convince everyone of their insane beliefs to get what they want. They just need to put people in a situation where doing what they want feels like the path of least resistance, even to death. Sakai felt that he was already going to die, so he might as well do it on his terms, in a way that he believed would keep Japan from being invaded. But what about the people who did buy the central importance of the emperor? Leaving aside the belief in the emperor's divinity, why did people believe in the emperor as Japan's central unifying figure, and why did they believe that all Japanese people needed to rally around him? What made them believe, while the people we already covered did not? The Battle of Okinawa was one of the most brutal of the Pacific theater of World War II. Around 100,000 Japanese troops were killed, and around 1/4 of Okinawa's civilian population was killed, also totaling around 100,000, mostly women and children, many of whom were killed after being forced into horrific suicide attacks on the invading American landing forces. Ota Masahide was an Okinawan who survived the American invasion. He believed that Japanese propaganda was particularly effective in Okinawa, and he takes the time to explain why he thinks that was the case. When I was a teenager, we had no other books but those with an imperial nation view of history. For people who lived in Tokyo or Kyoto, even though some books were prohibited, somewhere secretly those books were surely available. Moreover, in the higher schools, students had a fairly advanced education. If they wanted to, they could obtain different kinds of books and listen to progressive thinkers. Such possibilities were closed to us on the island. Okinawa was the only prefecture in all of Japan without either a technical school or university. The goal of our education was to create men who would fervently throw away their lives for the sake of the emperor, men who were full of loyalty. We had no way of knowing anything other than what we know. Therefore, we just did what we were told, and we did it believing in it. We were really ignorant of our own history. We had a subject called local history, but there were no lectures. We had no idea what happened to us when the old feudal domains were eliminated and the prefectures were established. We were a pure culture distilled by our education to be the emperor's subjects. The soldiers knew the reality of war because they had participated in battles in China, so they went into the depths of the caves and stayed there. We students, and those like us who didn't know anything, were told, "This is your homeland. It is natural for you to defend your motherland." We had no choice but to do it. We went without having even a healthy fear of war, and ended up being slaughtered. Ota believed that indoctrination in Okinawa was particularly effective, even compared to other places in Japan. It just goes to show that Japan was not a monolith, but it also points to Okinawa's unique history. Okinawans were seen as inferior Japanese people. This is probably one reason why Japan was so willing to make Okinawans commit national suicide to discourage the Allies from invading the mainland, which led the fighting in Okinawa to be particularly brutal. As Ota claimed, the particular tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa may have come from the fact that Okinawans came to see themselves this way too. Because of the past history of Okinawa, various influences from Burma, Thailand, and China entered Okinawan life, and with its different customs, habits, and language, Okinawa was supposed to lack in loyalty and patriotism. Okinawans could not be true members of the pure Japanese, and Okinawan had to cultivate loyalty to the emperor, conceding nothing in the intensity of his loyalty to the Japanese of the main islands. When the war was slow, Japanese soldiers spread the story that the defeat was the result of Okinawans spying for the enemy. Children from Okinawa, who were evacuated to Kyushu and other areas, were told the battle was lost because Okinawans had betrayed their country. There were a lot of dark incidents. Ota claims that a lack of education and feelings of inferiority led Okinawans to accept the propaganda more completely as a way to prove that they were loyal to Japan. This is extremely sad, but also again reinforces the idea that Japanese militarism had very little to do with Japanese culture. Here you have people that were disconnected from what was purported to be mainstream Japanese culture, who were desperate to prove themselves because they were seen as inferior in the Japanese Empire. That, combined with a lack of educational resources, shows how it was the hierarchy and material conditions of the Japanese Empire that led people to buy into militarism, and not culture. However, while Okinawans were told this made them part of a pure Japanese culture, their position outside of the mainstream is what made them more devoted. Japanese propaganda claimed that supporting the emperor made someone a part of pure Japanese culture, but the reason that Okinawan people bought the propaganda had nothing to do with their own cultural beliefs. However, in the emperor section of this video, I think the most important account is from Nogi Harumichi, a true believer in the mission of the Japanese Empire. Nogi joined the Patriotic Students Alliance at his university, where he was drawn into the secret world of far-right militarism, with its warring factions and differing war goals. He found himself as a part of the Navy's Southern Advance faction, and would eventually be groomed to become a colonial administrator in Indonesia. But before that, he talks about what first attracted him down that path. Beginning in 1939, Hitler's newsreels were shown every day. When I played hooky, I always went to see them. I'd watch those stirring movies about Hitler and wonder, what's the matter with the Japanese army in Manchuria? Why can't they just annihilate the British and Americans? Hitler took all of Poland and united it with Germany. Then I bought Hitler's heroic autobiography, Mein Kampf.
What the hell is even that?
Japanese youth at the time adored Hitler and Mussolini.
Bastic side-eye. Criminal offensive side-eye.
And yearned for the emergence of a Japanese politician with the same qualities. We wanted decisive action. Hashimoto Kingoro, a former army officer, and Nakano Seigo, a politician who advanced the Southern Advance, were two who took after Hitler and copied his style. I went to their speeches, all of them. Sometimes I'd be thrown out. Their supporters would demand to see my student ID, and they would say I wasn't old enough. Somehow, they didn't like students, so I'd take off my school uniform and sneak in. These meetings were held in Hibiya Public Hall, wherever extreme right-wing talks were given, on subjects like Attack America and Britain. Enormous crowds came. People brought boxed lunches and formed long lines from 6 in the morning to get in and hear Nakano Seigo endorsing the liberation. While teens today might get drawn down the alt-right pipeline with a bunch of shitty little dark age edits on TikTok, Nogi actually went out of his way to go see ultra-right-wing losers spew filth in person. And even crazier is he bought the actual book of the dude, the bad guy. The building we're walking up to now is Hibiya Public Hall. So just imagine like tons of people gathered here with their bentos to listen to those kinds of far-right speeches back in the day. It's quite an unassuming building right now, especially with all these, skyscrapers around here. But I just wanted to give y'all an idea that this is like right in the heart of Tokyo. Like down that way is the Imperial Palace, and just over there is Tokyo Station. And I think down that way is the Diet Building. So, these kinds of speeches weren't happening like out in some neighborhood somewhere in some small like conference center. This is, where everything was happening at the time. Let's see if we can go inside. Probably not. Let's try going around the side. Looks like we can get in just on the other side of the building. Kanji for shit. There seems to be all offices now. Let's see if we can go out the other way. Well, but yeah, super historical building. Give you an idea of the setting where some of this stuff is happening. Let me know what you think of these vlog portions. I don't know if I'll have the opportunity to do that many of them for every video, but alright, before I go, let's see what's up here. I just saw some people taking pictures, so I think it's okay. It's a lot of trash. Damn. I wonder if this place is ever open. It's an entrance. I imagine this is where he would have come in, where all the people would have come in to watch speeches calling for the destruction of Britain and America. Of course, this place would have been used for a lot more than just that. That's why it's still standing. Piece of history. Anyway, hope you guys like this vlog portion. Alright, and back to the video. I think at this point, Nogi's story could kind of be identical, whether you're looking at fascist youth in Germany or even in Italy. A desire for action, attraction towards charismatic leaders. It's all very, very textbook. But let's for a moment discuss what made Japanese fascism a bit unique, mainly its hypocritical anti-colonial rhetoric. Let me read you the paragraph that comes just before the two I just read to you. America and Britain had been colonizing China for many years. Japan came to this late. China was such a backward nation. At the time of the Manchurian incident in 1931, we felt that Japan should go there and use Japanese technology and leadership to make China a better country. What was actually happening on the battlefield was all secret then, but I felt sure that the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would be of critical importance to the backward races. Japan and Germany would only have to combine forces to break the Anglo-Saxon hold on Asia and redistribute the colonies. That's how we felt then. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would be the name of Japan's new fascist empire. There is no other empire or nation in human history with a more tragically ironic name. It started with a racist and paternalistic desire to quote-unquote civilize the people of Asia under Japanese tutelage. You see, many of the places that the Japanese Empire would conquer during World War II were previously owned by Europeans or the United States. China was a bit of an exception, but it was in the process of being colonized or seen as being semi-colonized. But as you can see, Nogi believed it was a backward nation, quote-unquote, that still needed Japan's help. But in reality, Japanese help was nothing more than slavery, murder, and sexual violence on a scale almost indescribable. While there is a focus on the rape of Nanking and discussing Japanese atrocities in China, and it was particularly bad, Japanese terror in China was far, far more extensive than I have time to cover in this video. However, despite all these atrocities, the idea of civilizing quote-unquote backward nations was an important part of Japanese propaganda at the time. Even amid the slaughter in China, Japan dropped propaganda pamphlets claiming, and I quote, "To liberate Asia from the white man's prison, it is the natural duty of every Asiatic. All of you Asiatics who have groaned under the yoke of the white man, unite." Using a twisted kind of Pan-Asianism, Japan believed that they were freeing members of the quote-unquote Asian races from the rule of whites. However, this also came with Japan's own racial supremacist ideology. Documents from the Japanese army even made this explicit by dividing people into quote-unquote master races, friendly races, and guest races, with the Japanese or Yamato race at the top as the quote-unquote leading race. This is bad enough, but European colonizers believed very similar things, so perhaps Japan's rule in places like Indonesia would be much the same as the Europeans that came before, despite claims of liberation from Japan. And certainly, that seems to be the way it was going at first. Here's what Nogi had to say about Japanese rule in Indonesia. A civil administration department was established in August of 1942. I was assigned to its legal section. I was thrown in there, even though I was just a candidate ensign. Well-educated Indonesians were assigned to each section. They had been working for the government since the Dutch period, and could bring out a great book of documents and records whenever I asked them a question. Japan recreated exactly the same structure the Dutch had used. If we removed that, we couldn't have administered the country. This was true even at the lowest levels. Each local district had its own head, with its own system of self-government. It was almost completely feudalistic and practically universal. The Dutch had controlled only the population of the city of Makassar, and the village headmen were in charge everywhere else. The Japanese military authorities followed the same pattern. We used the feudalistic system as it was. One of my first jobs was to go with the chief of the telephone communications section to inspect facilities needed for public order and security, including prisons, police, and telephones. We traveled through the southern part of Celebes by car. All seemed to be functioning well, and we Japanese were being treated as liberators who had expelled the Dutch from Indonesia. The haughty Dutch, who had lorded it over the Indies, found themselves prisoners overnight. When I got to the areas where Japanese forces had never been, village chiefs welcomed me. I wore a white military uniform, but concealed my pistol. They waved the Sun flag and the Indonesian flag too. I felt we were doing something wonderful there. To me, at least, it looked like they favored us. This lasted through the end of 1942. Then the military demanded an allotment from the rice harvest, from the depths of the Celebes. I'm pronouncing this wrong. I'm very sorry to anyone from Indonesia. It's this island, right here. Anyway, I'll continue. There was a stirring of tension among the locals, and the troops had to be mobilized to control it. Nogi's claim that the Japanese were seen as liberators at first is backed up by the historical record. After all, in many places in Asia, including in China decades before the war, Japan was seen as an ideal example of an Asian nation that had protected itself from colonization and had become a respected world power. However, as you see in Nogi's account, any initial support for Japan quickly dried up. After all, the fact that the Japanese literally used the exact same structure to rule as the Dutch showed that, in the best case scenario, things were going to stay the same. Nogi himself came to stop believing in their mission to liberate Asia, but that didn't stop him from participating in its subjugation. From then on, I was in charge both of the Special Naval Police and the boatmen being trained. They gathered the sons of Indonesian village heads and young local officials too. They were all smart. They were to be taught simple sailing techniques, Morse code, and hand signals. I had to teach them ideology, trying to explain why we were fighting this war, why they had to cooperate with us. My argument was that if Japan lost, their nation would remain a colony, and I asked them to cooperate until victory was achieved. I didn't truly believe those arguments any longer, but I used them anyway. I felt we were only turning them into our own colony. I had once imagined that we would be leading Indonesians in singing their independence anthem, WWII, but now we banned it. I even received orders that all nationalist movements were to be prohibited. We put local people into various key positions and then ordered them to report even the tiniest rumors to us. Nogi had been a true believer, totally committed to the mission of the co-prosperity sphere, attending the speeches of Japan's fascist talking heads, and even learning Indonesian and moving across the Pacific to take part in its creation. But he came to no longer believe it. And it didn't matter in the end. It didn't change his behavior. And in many ways, that's more chilling. The idea that showing someone that what they believe is wrong is enough to convince them to do the right thing seems intuitive. But what is scarier is that even if you show someone the truth, show them that what they are taking part in is unjustifiable, that may not be enough to stop anyone, simply because of the entropy that brought them into that position. In Nogi's mind, he still had a job to do, and it was truly terrible work. Nogi murdered the same people that he believed he was going to liberate, executing Indonesians for the smallest of offenses, and killing POWs despite knowing it was illegal under international law. Just listening to shortwave, well, that was enough of a reason to execute them. It was in military law and was accepted. We had such cases. I was cautious, though. I never did it in front of the eyes of the locals. Even when we had to do something, I never let them see. It wasn't a humanistic matter to me. It was tactical. It would have been bad strategy to stir them up. I judged that I would get stronger negative reactions if we tried to make an example of violators than if we didn't. In other areas, they did make examples. But in my area, when they knew we'd capture someone for acting against us, I always sent a notice to their village informing them that the party had escaped, even when they'd actually been executed. Often we had trials first. I knew our military occupation would be powerless if the locals began guerrilla activities against us. During this period, in 1944, American pilots fell in our area. Army and Navy staff officers came to interrogate them, bringing maps on which they could pinpoint locations. After they had extracted the intelligence they wanted from them, the orders came down. Process them. I knew it was illegal. I had studied some law. I knew international regulations. But every day, those two-engine lockheads would come and run wild, doing what they wanted. All our planes had been destroyed. We could offer no resistance. We were enraged and frustrated. When you lose your own fighting capabilities and can only suffer under their attacks, you become vengeful yourself. We'll get them. They'll pay for this. It's illegal, I thought, but the only choice for Japan is total annihilation or victory. If we go on losing like this, we'll never return home alive. Will I be questioned for my responsibility? Not likely. We'll all be dead. If we win, there's nothing to worry about because it was ordered from above. Welling up within myself, I felt sentiments like, how dare they bomb us? We can't give them special treatment just because they're prisoners. I can never forgive them. When I appeared at my trial as a war criminal, I didn't say that, of course. I said I had no choice but to obey orders. But the truth is, I wanted to kill them. Still, when I saw their faces, I pitied them. They were as young as ours. The soldiers who'd prepared the ground for execution and who dug the graves all watched me. Saying this today, I feel ashamed. I had a strange vanity. I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of the men. If I analyzed my psychology today, I would say I killed them because of that. They were very pale. Their eyes were blindfolded properly. You had to have an actual document, a written sentence and an order of execution to do it. But there was no trial or hearing. I knew this was illegal. They asked, why? If I'd listened to them, my own spirit would have been dulled. So holding onto my sword, I made them kneel down. While Nogi recognized that what he was doing was wrong in some small way, perhaps, under the belief that Japan's loss would mean total annihilation, frustration at Allied attacks, and some sick comfort in the fact that he was just following orders, along with the desire to fit in with his peers, Nogi became a killer. It wasn't because of any ideological commitment or any belief that it was necessary to fulfill Japan's holy mission. Again, we see the idea purported by Sakai, our kamikaze pilot from earlier, the belief that for Japan the only options were victory or annihilation. In our popular understanding, these two options for the future they saw, victory or annihilation, were self-imposed by the Bushido Code or something. For Japan's leaders and ideologues, this may have been the case, but it also came from the idea that the American enemy would destroy Japan completely if they got the chance. With our own bombing campaigns, with the ferocity in which Japanese and Americans fought in the Pacific, and with our own propaganda, we gave them reason to believe it. A picture from the American magazine Life, showing a Japanese skull being displayed as a trophy by American soldiers, had become infamous in Japan, just as images of Japanese soldiers chopping the heads off of prisoners had become famous in the US. To Japanese propagandists, this was evidence that the Japanese were fighting for their very existence, despite being the aggressors, while the Americans only fought because of their racism and their desire to preserve their own luxury. But I'll say it again, this doesn't justify shit. Japan was the aggressor, and their treatment of conquered people and of prisoners of war is some of the most evil and repugnant shit you will ever read about. Again, I'm just trying to show you what motivated people to do the unjustifiable, rather than justify the unjustifiable. But this part of the video is supposed to be about the emperor. So what did the disillusioned militarists think of the emperor? Did that also change over time? I posted 2 slogans in my Tokatai office. We are the emperor's subordinates, and the people's mind is our fortress. I never thought of the emperor as divine, but I have to admit I used his authority. I really did believe, and told my men, that we dare not lose the local people's mind in the course of accomplishing our duties. He never believed in the divinity of the emperor, even as he used the emperor's authority to carry out conquest and control others. It was simply a tool that represented the state's authority, more than any god. It was used to keep people in line. But how effective was it? As the war progressed and conditions began to deteriorate, how did people behave? Among Japanese forces, the atmosphere became more and more brutal. Violent incidents occurred regularly. Superiors were beaten up by drunken soldiers. A naval captain beat up a civilian administrator, accusing him of being presumptuous. There was even a murder that was hushed up. The victim, it was said, died of illness, and when I tried to investigate anyway, I was told the case was closed. The captain in charge cursed me out. Don't poke your beak where it doesn't belong. A battle of annihilation is imminent. If we punish this man, we'll be reducing the fighting strength of Japan. Then he suggested that I leave the police unit. How would you like to be in charge of an air defense unit? It was a threat. If you commanded anti-aircraft guns, you were the target of an avalanche of bombs. The incident convinced me that the military was a capricious organization not worthy of my trust. From then on, I no longer encouraged the men under my command to track down crimes. Near the end, when even we had to grow our own food, we found ourselves fighting over local laborers, pulling them this way and that. The army tried to pinch ours, threatening to use the Kimpei tie. Our food rations were reduced by 40%. Half the unit worked to build military positions. The other half were farmers. We were really hungry, but we couldn't say so. We just had to endure. We paid local residents for their labor, but it was military script, virtually worthless. The Navy had grudges against the Army for not providing sufficient provisions. Right there on the front lines, the Japanese Army and the Navy fought just like enemies. Had the war gone on 6 months more, I'm sure they would have started shooting at each other, trying to grab each other's provisions. I myself felt that the local Kimpei Tai unit had been acting outrageously, cooking up false claims just to get points for doing something. They were dragging out village chiefs one after another, calling them spies and executing them. The Japanese military was never of one mind. I've already made a few allusions to the factionalism in the Japanese military, but one of the biggest splits was between the Army and Navy, and starvation and poor conditions would only exasperate these divides. Also worth noting is that the local labor that Nogi refers to was enslaved Indonesians. Nogi himself admits that they were paid in useless military script, but they were totally slaves. There's really no other way around that. I have a crackpot theory about the use of the emperor in Japanese propaganda. It's not very well researched or anything, so take it with a grain of salt, but here it is. As the Army and the Navy fought for slaves and food in Indonesia, as they had disagreements about what the war should look like or what the primary enemy should be, with many in the Army wanting to fight the Soviet Union and not even necessarily the Americans, and amidst all the ideological difference that I can't even begin to mention, the Emperor united them. It was a way to consolidate all these different groups towards a common goal and work despite disagreements. As Nogi says, the Army and Navy almost came to blows, and I believe him. Lip service to the Emperor and his authority can only carry your goals so far. As Japan's terrible empire collapsed and all semblance of order dissolved, a terrible situation only got much, much worse. The unit across the hill with a bit more food can begin to look like a more enticing target, despite the fact that you're all fighting for the same emperor, who is a world away in Tokyo.
Ah!
I'm just using US propaganda films to make a loose guideline, to give these videos at least a little bit of cohesion. But let's move on from the Emperor, and discuss something a little bit more vague, but also easy to disprove. Our enemy, the Japanese, the propaganda film I mentioned earlier, has some very strange things to say about Japanese people.
The farm family accepts hard work and squalor with the unfeeling stoicism of a disciplined race.
Other films like My Japan, an American film made to convince Americans back home to buy more war bonds, make similar claims, as a white American dude does a really bad Japanese accent, as he claims to supposedly share the Japanese viewpoint with the audience.
It is a fact that human lives are cheap. Unlike you, we have no cowardly illusions about their value. So we spend lives freely. Yours and ours. Freely, did I say? I am too modest. Lavishly is more accurate. I refer you to what My Japan told you early in the war. We are prepared to spend 10 million lives to defeat you. How many are you willing to spend?
Know Your Enemy Japan also makes claims which support the idea that Japanese people are supposedly unfeeling and willing to endure anything.
That's why Jap soldiers would rather be killed than surrender. For to be killed means they become warrior gods. To surrender means everlasting shame and dishonor to them and their family and all their ancestors. If you are Japanese, you believe these things implicitly. That's why mothers and wives accept the ashes of their dead soldiers without grief or sorrow. The silent victorious return, it is called.
Of course, Japanese people were not all willing to die, and were not all the unsympathetic robots that these films make them out to be. I'm not going to spend too much time disproving that fact. If what I haven't already shown you isn't enough to convince you, just watch any movie made in Japan in the last 80 years. I mean, half of them are like watching a blank screen with the words "war bad" flashing over and over again for an hour and a half. It's clear that the suffering caused by the war has left generational scars in Japan and in its historical memory that still persists to this day. So let's go the other way and talk about some of those who were willing to die for Japan. In our modern understanding, the willingness of the Japanese soldier to lay down their life is best represented in the kamikaze attacks later in the war. We've already talked about one man who survived. Let's try to see why else someone might be willing to take such drastic actions. So of course, let's just leave aside the kamikazes entirely and talk about something completely different. The Chitin Corps, piloted torpedoes that killed their operators, and for our purposes, are indistinguishable from kamikazes. Basically the same. Has pilot drives weapon, explodes, they all die. Very sad. We are going to talk about two surviving members of the Chitin Corps, with very different accounts. Yokota Yutaka and Kozu Naoji, both teenagers during Pearl Harbor. Yokota was 16 and Kozu was in his second year of high school, so probably around the same age. Their most formative years would have been at the height of fascist control in Japan. They would have gotten the full force of indoctrination, in school, in the media, and in their daily lives, as even advertisements and children's clothes had taken on militarist imagery. Japan had been at war since 1931, about a decade before Pearl Harbor. And while the fascist mania that gripped Japan would have gotten progressively worse leading up to Pearl Harbor, it would have been a part of Yokota and Kozu's lives since they were toddlers, and they would not have been able to remember how things were before. In Yokota, we see the result of such indoctrination, and how it made someone a perfect candidate for the Chitin Corps. Your motherland faces imminent peril. Consider how much your motherland needs you. Now, a weapon which will destroy the enemy has been born. If any among you who burn with a passion to die gloriously for the sake of their country, let them step forward. Mark the paper before you with 2 circles. If you do not care one way or the other, inscribe a single circle. Those who do not wish to go may throw away their paper. Do not think of returning alive. These arms have not been created in order that you may return alive. Weigh your decision overnight. In the morning, present the appropriate paper to your section commander. We heard those words as we stood assembled before the commander of our school. We were all graduating from Youth Flying Corps, the Yokaden, at Tsuchiura Naval Academy Station. At that very moment, I decided, I'm going. Really impressed by the 9 war gods of the midget submarines, who were credited by the paper for much of the success at Hawaii. They weren't, of course, actual human torpedoes, but even then, I thought to myself, I wouldn't mind dying like that. I was a militaristic youth. I had been purely cultivated to serve. I wanted to go to Etajima, the Naval Academy, but I never got in. You had to have perfect parents. Above reproach. Mine were always fighting. The Kinpeitai, military police, came to investigate our family. I was rejected. I gave up that hope and jumped into Yokaden. But if I had entered the Naval Academy at that time, the war would have ended with me still a candidate ensign. I would have never participated in the war. So, flunking the Naval Academy made my life much more fruitful. I really am grateful that I was rejected. At the time, I was afraid that if I only wrote double circles, I might not be chosen, even though I had one of the best records in our squad and was very strong in judo. Underneath my circles, I added, "Without reservation, I request that you select me, Okata-kan." I wrote it in big letters and handed it in. I was picked first. When selected, I felt a slight sense of sadness. My life now had no more than a year to go, but I was already in Yokkaren. I wasn't thinking of surviving the war. I'd rather get shot down by some plane. Better to die grandly, go out in glory. 94%, I heard, put down double circles. 5% put a single circle, and less than 1% threw their paper away. I was exhilarated, but I remember Noguchi, who held the second grade in Kendo. They didn't choose him. He dashed up to our squad commander with a desperate look in his eyes. "How could you leave me? Why wouldn't you take me?" He was in tears. "Please make me the 101st. They chose 100 out of 2,000. In the end, he wasn't allowed to go. But he tried so hard to be one of us. We trained desperately. We couldn't complain of pain or anything. You had to push on. If I didn't hit the target, if I have to self-detonate, I'll die without doing what I must." It was agony for everyone. Yokota seems to be the perfect image of a radicalized Japanese youth who was willing to put his life aside to win the war. Even as he recounts his experiences decades later, he refers to Japanese soldiers who died in a submarine in Pearl Harbor as war gods, reflecting the nationalist Shinto rhetoric also used to affirm the emperor's divine status. He also made it seem like all Japanese youth were just as devoted and claims that 94 wished to serve and join the Kaiten Corps, forfeiting their lives for the motherland. However, Kozu has a very different account of Kaiten Corps recruitment. I was sent to the anti-submarine warfare school in February of 1944 and was stuck there until the end of October. I was fed up with school by then. What am I doing in this place? I asked myself that when they started calling for volunteers who were full of energy, who were willing to take up a dangerous job, and willing to board a special weapon that would reverse the tide of the war at once. Why not? It's going to be better than this. I applied for it carelessly. About 90% of us volunteered. As we were beginning our training, the first announcement of kamikaze attacks was made. I think that was October 29th. Reading the news of the WWII Special Attack Corps in the newspaper, planes crashing into enemy ships, I was boiled over. Even then, I didn't grasp the true nature of the kamikazes. I still wondered, what are they going to do if they parachute down in the middle of an enemy fleet? Yet there I was. We couldn't share our doubts with each other. We were all drawn from different universities. If I had expressed my disquiet, my university could have been disgraced. I had to keep my own counsel. Today, I know they deceived us. I know that with all my heart. But then, and for many years afterwards, I thought it must have been me. I must have misheard them. We only received explanations orally. I thought I missed what they said. Even a decade ago, I had some doubts. But in 1987, a document turned up. When I saw that for the first time, I knew. The document had been drafted August 20th and issued August 31st, 1944, by the Chief of the Personal Bureau and the Chief of Education of the Imperial Navy. It bears the seal of the Navy Minister and his chief subordinates. It sets forth instructions for recruiting and training reserve student officers to fill positions in special weapon units, and outlines how to select and train them. It expressly forbids touching on the weapon's capabilities or its use. Those doing the soliciting were instructed to say only that if you attack in the weapon, you'll kill the enemy without fail. They were told to state that some danger was involved, but that was all. Seeing those words in print, I knew they'd misled us deliberately. As we were waiting to move to our final staging base at Hikari, we received a postcard from one of our commanders who'd gone ahead of us. It was only, "Say hello to Kudo." That was our code phrase for escape is impossible. Until that moment, we had no confirmation that the Kaiten was a self-exploding weapon which gave you no chance to escape death. Yokota and Kuzo both show how lots of people signed up for the Kaiten Corps, but while Yokota may have assumed it was a suicide weapon, Kuzo claims that it was a kind of deception. I believe Kuzo is correct, and that young men were manipulated to join by propaganda glorifying sacrifice, and because recruitment was done orally, it's possible that Yokota was told the truth about the weapon, while Kuzo was deceived, but we'll never really know. But whether or not they were lied to, once Kuzo had joined, he felt there was no going back. I was supposed to be ready for this, but the shock nearly knocked me down. In the summer of 1946, I recorded my thoughts at that moment. At last, we saw the weapon we would ourselves board. I sensed something larger than the power of a human being, glowering down at me. I lost my reason and my emotion. I was dumbfounded. I felt that I had myself turned into something no longer human. I couldn't really tell, at that time, whether what I sensed was higher or lower than a human being. But I felt I now knew why we human beings could no longer control our own destiny. If you worked at it carefully, you could get out of the chitin Corps. All you had to do was fail to operate a chitin properly and do the same thing again on your second try. You'd be shouted at, "You stupid bastard, we won't let a dumb shit like you operate a chitin," and they'd take you off the list. But I never thought of escaping myself. That would only have meant someone else dying in my place. Even if the whole unit had been replaced, they'd have found others. It was that kind of system. I couldn't bear the idea of sacrificing someone else by quitting. I knew that if I did, I'd regret it for the rest of my life, even if I never knew his name. I hated the thought that I'd fail and they'd say, "Those reserve students are no good." I couldn't do that to the others. I wanted to navigate well. Like they say in Chinese, "Mei fa," it can't be helped. I was resigned to it. But even still, Kuzo was able to justify his actions, and felt there was some purpose to what he was doing, besides just avoiding making someone else go in his place. I never thought the Emperor could act on his own. I didn't see myself throwing my life away for him, nor for the government either, nor for the nation. I saw myself dying to defend my parents, my brothers and sisters. For them I must die, I thought. Even Yokota, as fanatical as he seemed, had more personal motivations for throwing his life away for the Japanese Empire. "Chitin pilots, board, prepare your chitins." The sub-speakers blared. Our time had come. Once again we tied our hachimaki above our heads. Because we were men, we were vain. It would have been a disgrace to lose composure. "We are now departing," we declared. "Please await our achievements." You clambered up the ladder to the hatch leading up to your chitin. You didn't have much time, but you still looked down and forced yourself to smile. "I'm going now," was all you said. You wanted to be praised after you died, just as much as you wanted it during your life. You wanted them to say, "Yokata was young, but he went with incredible bravery. He was dignified to the end." It would have been terrible if they said, "He went shaking, so unlike a chitin pilot." There was only one like that in our whole group. He was a disgrace to the chitin Corps. I cut him out of pictures of us preparing to depart, but that's not important anymore. Yokata seems to have been a very tragically reckless young man who wanted to prove something to himself, to others, and the paragraph before only supports that assumption. We were young. We often talked about women. Dirty jokes were the stock in trade. We never talked about loyalty or bravery or the nobility of the soul. We were just like brothers. I always had a picture of my mother in my pocket. She died when I was 4. Whenever I boarded my chitin, the words, "Ma, I'll soon be there with you," escaped my lips. I don't want to psychoanalyze Yokata more than I already have, but I think it's possible that he was willing to die because of the tragedy he had experienced in his own life. But I can't say for sure. What I am willing to guess, though, is that his reasons were intensely personal, and that the community of chitin pilots that Yokata found himself among probably helped harden his resolve. After all, it's much easier to do something terrible when you have your brother beside you doing the same. This was especially the case for Yokata, I think, who even went so far to cut someone out of photographs, just because he showed he was afraid. It shows the importance of that community to him, and the importance of the resolve that came with it. But, however much I try to understand someone like Yokata, there are inevitably some aspects that I will never be able to grasp, and always some that I'll find haunting. Historians like John Dower have shown that Japanese ideologues and leaders successfully created a cult of death that in some ways infected the entire military and even all of Japanese society during the war. There is no clearer manifestation of this cult of death than the chitin Corps and other so-called special attack units. I just hope that I can show you how some of even the most devoted death cultists did so for their own terrible reasons. Even in Kozu's case, while he was coerced into joining, he eventually found his own reasons to follow through. Of course, both these men, boys really, survived the war and lived to tell their story. While we can never know what these men and boys who died locked up in a chitin felt in their last moments, Kozu has a guess. It was horrible to contemplate death in a chitin. Many young men charged into the enemy and died during the war. In kamikaze planes, in Oka manned rocket bombs, in Shinyo boats. If everything went well for them, and the battleship that was their target was close, looming in front of them, at least they could count the seconds to impact. 3, 2, 1. Then as long as they kept their eyes open, they know the moment of their deaths. I'd imagine that this video has already gotten far longer than I intended, so I will make one last point, and consider the words of John Dower, one of the leading historians of the Pacific War. I think we may be able to better understand the cults of death that made World War II Japan so difficult to reckon with, and along the way, gain an incomplete answer to the question of the real role that culture plays in the radicalization of different societies. John Dower states, It is true that Japanese commanders and ideologues attempted with considerable success to make a cult out of dying, as seen in the frenzied banzai charges of Imperial land forces and in the creation of special suicide squads such as kamikazes in the final years of the war. But Westerners also glorify those who fought to the bitter end, and in several instances, Allied leaders at the highest level, including Winston Churchill and Douglas MacArthur, actually ordered their commanders never to surrender. Even as Americans were belittling Japanese who fought to the last man, treating them as virtually another species of being, they were cherishing their own epics of defeat, such as the Alamo and the Little Bighorn. While Dower talks about the kamikaze corps, his comparisons to the US don't entirely extend to the special attack units. I think it shows that there wasn't a fundamental difference in thinking, but perhaps a massive difference in degree. I can't imagine an American version of the Chiton Corps, or of the kamikaze, but in the nuclear age, if an aggressive and sufficiently radicalized nation ever got as desperate as Japan did when they began to use kamikazes late in the war, they probably just hit the big red button at some point and hard quit on civilization for everyone. I mean, hell, we used 2 nukes and we were winning the goddamn war already. However, the stories that were ever present in Japanese propaganda of soldiers making a last stand or sacrificing themselves certainly have their place in Allied propaganda and in our own historical memory of the war. If you just change the names around a bit, I'm sure those stories can seem very familiar. I mean, in Captain America, Steve Rogers literally jumps on a grenade that he thinks is going to kill him, and this proves that he has the proper character to become the embodiment of American wartime virtue. And let's not even mention the end of the film. But of course, let's not minimize the true degree of difference here. If I did that, I would minimize one of the most uniquely terrible features of Japanese fascism. I just want to argue that what made World War II Japan so terrible is something that we can stand to learn from, regardless of where we are from or what our culture is. For this whole video, I've been trying to show that culture was not the root cause of Japan's fall into fascism. But the last thing I want to do is minimize cultural differences and make them seem like they're non-existent. Of course, Japan has its own unique culture, and with it comes its own values, practices, and preconceptions. Japan's fascist propaganda during the war was obsessed with defining and using Japanese culture to justify its own goals. They used culture as a tool to create a cult of death. They pointed to misconceptions about ritual suicide during the samurai eras, and twisted centuries-old cultural practices to manufacture their own idea of Japanese culture and of Japanese people. They did not dig up the past or return to tradition with a V. They created tradition itself. They claimed that something as modern as a nation-state and as terrible as fascism really had their roots in a fake past. Japan's militarist leaders were not the first to do this. It was a key part of the creation of the Japanese nation-state in the 1870s, and across the world it's a key feature of nationalist rhetoric. But Japan's later militarists would have their own ideas and take things to a new extreme. But I want to dive more in depth into that in a different video. What matters is that you don't take the claims of Japanese militarists to heart. Whatever they claimed, they were not reviving the true heart of the Yamato race. They were not rejecting Western degeneracy and returning to an imagined imperial past as they often claimed. They are fascist. As modern as they are brutal, culture to them is just a mask or a mold, something to be imagined and returned to, rather than something that actually was. To return to Kozu's account for a moment, it seems like he himself accepted the historical fiction about samurai. Dispatching the attack force was a grand show, let me tell you. It was so thrilling. Probably every man who sent his fellow was himself carried away with excitement. It was almost like the departure for battle of a great general and his samurai warriors in the feudal age, very different from the push-button war of today. There was a sense of man-to-man combat in it. In the army, war had already become a clash of power against power, a battle of tank divisions, or mass war like infantry attack in Burma. The individual was obliterated in a war like that. Even air was no longer a clash of lone warriors, but the chiton was still an individual affair. An elaborate ritual was staged, a grand send-off. Kozu's image of samurai matched the pre- and post-war samurai films far more than any historical reality. In this way, Dower's comparison to the Alamo and Little Bighorn are particularly telling. While the Japanese nationalists may have used historical fiction about the samurai and stories about their sacrifice as their own historical fiction, Americans used the idea of the cowboy or the pioneer warrior, also presented in our westerns, just as Japan's samurai films display Japan's own nationalist hero myths. But in case you still don't believe me, I want you to do something for me if you ever find yourself at the Alamo. Look for a small plaque with Japanese writing. You may miss it, but it's worth the small detour. It's from 1914, long before Japan's foray into fascism, at a time when our nationalist myths were perhaps more similar, before Japan sent young men to die in weapons meant to kill them. The monument was donated by a visiting Japanese professor and claims to tell the story of the Alamo of Japan, The specifics aren't important. It talks about a bunch of samurai who died in battle. The place is different, but the sentiments are really the same. Perhaps Dower had no idea how telling his comparison really was. Of course, Japan and America are very different countries, with very unique histories. But so are America and Germany, for that matter. And if we can accept that Germany's fall into fascism can teach us a lot, or perhaps provide us a warning for the future, then why can't Japan? For every similarity I have pointed to you, you can probably point out 11 differences on your own. My argument doesn't hinge on the fact that differences exist. I'm just trying to argue that the similarities that do exist matter a lot and can help us learn from the history of Japan. Because after all, perhaps the Japanese mind isn't as incomprehensible as we were once led to believe. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and thank you so much for watching all the way through. This video isn't as well researched as perhaps I would like it to be, but I just wanted to get used to the process of making a YouTube video. There should be another one that's extremely in-depth coming up in the next few months. Thank you so much for watching. Yeah, subscribe more in the future.